You've seen a lot of different organizations and a lot of industries. What are some of the examples of folks who are doing this well? Like who's getting the data architecture and the data-driven design pieces right?
Building great experiences, revolutionize your business. Building great experiences, innovative strategies. Building great experiences, elevate for your customers. Like, comment, and subscribe.
Hey folks, this is Drew with another episode of the Building Great Experiences podcast. Today, I have Michael Vandenstockt with me on the call. Mike's a principal consultant at a company called Veestockt and has lots and lots of experience thinking through how to drive digital transformation, how to create e-commerce experiences that convert, and also a lot in the marketing space. But today, what we're going to be talking about is data architecture and how it intersects with customer experience. So, Mike, welcome to the show, man.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having me. It's great to see you again, Drew.
For sure.
So, for the past 20 years, I've basically helped e-commerce businesses, particularly in the CPG sector, on optimizing how they grow data how they grow data-driven decision-making. So I work with both large legacy retailers and fast-moving direct-to-consumer brands. I've seen firsthand how clean, well-structured data can drive everything from inventory optimization to personalized marketing campaigns.
That's awesome, man. Yeah, thanks for the kind of tee up. So why don't you tell folks a little bit more about yourself, your background, how you got started, and maybe just a little bit about what data architecture is and why it matters.
Yeah, sure. So, I've been doing this for about 20 years. And really, when I started, the internet was fresh and new. And companies that were doing direct response advertising, like in catalogs, magazines, were really kind of at the forefront of how websites and e-commerce were being developed, right? Because a lot of the tenets around data-driven decision-making have come from the direct response industries, right? Of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, right? And so in growing up that way, I've always had this really focused drive towards understanding data and whether something is successful or not, right? And it can be applied to every area of a business, not just growth or marketing. And ultimately, when it comes down to data architecture, it's like the blueprint of a building, right? But it's for information flow. It outlines how data is collected, stored, and shared among different systems. Think of it like city planning for your organization, deciding on how roads, which could be integrations, connect with different neighborhoods like departments, and ensuring public utilities like databases are accessible to everyone who needs them. And so, having that background in really wanting to make sure I was making the right decisions, data architecture, I found over the years was so integral to making the right decisions when you're doing data-driven decision-making, right? Time after time, I'd be in an organization and this system would say, sales were this. And another system would say sales were 5% different, right? And you had this team who was using this data, this team who was using that data. And honestly, quite often, things would come to a stalemate because people didn't trust the data, right? And so when you talk about data architecture, it's not just planning where individual data points are stored and how they connect with each other. It's also thinking about the governance and what gets entered in there and what gets used, right? Like if you have sales figures in two different systems, which one do we have more confidence in? And then ensuring that your organization understands, how you're looking at things and trusts what you're sharing with them, right? Because you can have significant success in business, but generally, if you have struggles around your internal teams trusting data, then a lot of what's going to happen is intuition based. And there's some founders that I've met that can run a whole business based on their intuition and never look at data. And that's amazing, but that's very far and few between, especially when you scale, right? So I found, founders who get to a certain point in their business and they plateau, and they kind of wonder how to get to the next step. And a lot of times it has to do with being more data driven and being able to put structure in place for the people that they, right? Like, what KPIs are important? How do you manage through those KPIs, right? How do you measure their success? Ultimately, if that's all designed well and accurate, it really sets you up for good growth and success.
Yeah, well, great start. I am very intrigued, and I know when we talked to Coffee a few months ago, we kind of dug into this, the importance of data driven decision making. I don't know if you knew this. I used to work at a company called Red Ventures, which for those in Charlotte are probably familiar. And RV is one of the, at least in the Southeast, like one of the top companies that focus on growth marketing, performance marketing, whatever you want to call it. And everything that they do is data. It's data driven, right? While I was there, it was really cool to learn about, we were doing multivariate testing, like of everything. You would have a lot of the brands that they work with are big, massive brands, and then they have their own brands that they've also acquired or built. And a lot of what they're thinking through is like, okay, how do I know where people are going? Where are they getting stuck? What are they clicking on? How are they responding? And you have data on all of those things. So it's really almost like fish in a barrel, to be honest, when you're trying to figure out like how to move people through the sales funnel. And, it's interesting because when I left Red Ventures, I went to another organization and a lot of it was qualitative. And I think there's like this beautiful intersection between like the quantitative side of data and the qualitative side, because some of that stuff, the anecdotal stuff, it fills in the gaps that the quant doesn't quite tell the story of, or doesn't give you a clear picture of. And so that's where I think there's like a magic that happens when you have this, a lot of data, quantitative data that you can, to your point, is trustworthy, believable, or understandable. And then you layer in the, like, let me go talk to real customers and get those anecdotal insights to help me fill in the nuances that you may not see from, person A clicked on this and then they went here and they did that. I'm curious, like, how do you think about qualitative data and how that plays a role?
So I'm really a mix of a scientist and an artist in what I do, or I try to be, right? And so I'm very focused on the scientific method. And what I would say is qualitative really helps you to generate hypotheses, right? Qualitative is how you get your ideas and your direction. I did the same thing, quite honestly. Like, I had a big website upgrade for a very large retailer and spent a number of weeks speaking with current customers who are using that B2B platform and getting their feedback. And then qualitative is also great on the back end. It's not just on the front end, right? So you go ahead and, you get your ideas out of some qualitative research, and then you implement it, but measuring whether it's successful at scale is generally, on the quantitative side, right? But you also should be using similar qualitative techniques as to the next step in improving what you're doing, right? So, you measure, you see, okay, well, I'm getting a 1.5 conversion rate, or I'm getting a 6.0 conversion rate, right? It's very valuable then to get on the horn with somebody who's using it and saying, okay, we rolled out this new stuff. What do you like about it? What don't you like about it? Right. And that can give you those ideas for the next step in your continual progression. Because I'm a big believer in mechanisms, like how Bezos defines them. Right. And so improvement never ends. It's feedback loops. Right. And so, you're bouncing back and forth between qualitative and quantitative data. Quantitative data really is kind of your evidence of whether you were successful or not. And qualitative comes into more of the creative aspects, I would say.
Yeah, man, I completely agree. I think the upfront hypothesis generation is so much easier to do when you've talked to people and like when you've been able to kind of gather those those insights. And then to your point at the end, having that, tight feedback loop where you can test things with customers or users and say, like, what do you think? Is this good? Is it not good? Why not? And you start to, like, I've seen multiple times where, like, I remember I was doing a project, I don't know, this is probably 10 years ago now. And we were doing things and the quantitative data told one story, and we went and talked to the contact center who were like, and we did this thing where we'd like plug in and listen to them talking to customers. And it became like pretty evident, like the specific thing that we were selling was, it was a internet telco provider, and they were selling these like triple play, basically like phone, TV, internet packages. And we were messaging things on the website a certain way. We had landing pages that were driving people to kind of purchase in a certain way. And what was happening is the customers would get on the phone, talk to the sales agent, and they like didn't really understand what they were buying. There was like more time spent on the contact center, call center side to sell the customer because we were just kind of like pushing them straight to click in and call, right? And so what we discovered, we're like, oh, we need to educate the consumer more on site so they know what they're clicking on before we send them to the call center. And that, it was this interesting thing because it was like, although the click-through rate was high, the like conversion on the other side was low and also took more time. Like the call center folks couldn't take as many calls, like call volume that they could handle was like much lower. So anyway, it was just getting that full picture, right? Seeing like, what is the quantitative data telling you? What is the qualitative data telling you? And sometimes, I've also had it the other way where you're making decisions based on qualitative data. Then you start to look at it at scale and you're like, wait a second, I think we might have had like a sample size too small, right? Like the sample size was this many people, and really that was an outlier. They weren't indicative of the broader sort of population or audience. So I'm curious, I'm sure you've done a lot of work with like customer data platforms, and customer 360, which is a kind of a constant conversation I've had with folks. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that concept and how real or feasible it is. Because I think sometimes people kind of talk about it, but it feels like fantasy, right? And I'm sure you've seen scenarios where it's been real and it's been able to, people have a good 360-degree view of their customer.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's easier to gather the data for a 360-degree view than it is to interpret it. So I think you can collect a mountain of data, but if you don't have the tools or the skill sets within the team to understand how attribution is actually working, right? Like there's a little bit of it ends up becoming a mix of more science and art once you start to get into attribution, because it's very clear if you're looking at one KPI and you're focusing on whether it goes up or down, right? But when you start to add in multiple variables, right? Like this one person went to, came through Facebook, then also, came back on Google, then came through an email and purchased, right? And then this other person came directly, and this other one came 7 or 8 times before. You can start to see that data, and if you have a large enough sample size, you can start to make some sense of it, but it's never truly going to be like a 0-1, yes, no, this is right, this is wrong, right? So that's where years of experience and somewhat kind of intuition around seeing everything and understanding come into play. Like, when I was in the tobacco industry and we were selling cigars, we had, for a number of years, been on a steady decline when it came to being able to market in certain channels. Meaning, in the beginning, we could sell cigars by directly taking people to a product page, right? And then we had to take them to reviews pages. Then we had to take them to pages that, didn't talk about tobacco at all, right? And so as time went on and things became more restrictive in that industry, it had to explore other avenues. Like we decided we were going to test SiriusXM national radio campaign, right? And so if you think about how easy it is to track and trace things online, if you're sending an email, right, or you're running a paid ad, well, there starts to become these layers of ambiguity that as you use other methods in marketing, right? So we're running SiriusXM campaigns. Yes, we were doing direct response ads. So you had to, like we gave a code that, the radio host would say. And we found that maybe 20% of what we thought was coming from it actually would put a code in. What we ended up seeing, though, is when we launched this national campaign, immediately our direct and organic traffic went up 30%. Like overnight, it was like this clear demarcation. Now, I can't say that all of that traffic came from SiriusXM, but there's a correlation, right? And there's not 100% confidence in something like that. And then you can get into deeper trying to understand more quantitatively, like, okay, what did we get spikes in traffic at the time the commercials ran, that kind of stuff. But again, you have to have resources behind it. So yeah, so that's, I'm completely on board with you there around, how using situations in measurement, like you need to make data-driven decisions, but you can't be so rigid because a lot of times you may not be seeing the entire picture. Like if I were just tracking codes on those, the radio ads, I might think that it didn't actually, it wasn't actually successful, but then, correlating these other channels improvements at the same time, made it so that inevitably we grew at a significantly faster pace than, the majority of our competitors because of the balance, right?
Yeah. So space makes me think about personalization, which has like been really, I've been having a lot of good conversations with people lately about this, especially with AI, where historically, as we think about marketing, e-commerce, you're thinking about segments and audiences or personas, right? And you're kind of like, there's a group of people and you have some characteristics of those people that kind of like you try to use to logically bucket them into some classification. So then you can communicate to them in a way that's going to resonate and make them do something, right? But now it's like we're moving and more towards true personalization, or, others call it hyper personalization. Basically, like you're tailoring everything to one individual person, right? So it's like Mike lives in Charlotte, cares about these things, has, lives in this zip code, does these whatever, like follows these pages and can deliver you content that's like for you alone, that with high level of confidence, we know is going to be, something that you're going to click on and take action on or buy, right? And I think that's going to be really interesting to watch. And related to that, I think it's going to be interesting to see how like data architecture today, it's like there's a lot of energy and effort that's spent on taking data, structuring that data, presenting it in a meaningful fashion so that people can like interpret and understand and take action and do something with it, right? We're now in the world where large language models, you don't have to give it structured data at all. It can just figure it out, right? It just, here's a bunch of documents and a bunch of reports, and here's some Excel files, and here's some other stuff. Tell me the answer to these questions, right? And it'll figure it out for you. Anyway, I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'd be careful with generative AI in that it does have a tendency to not get things right all the time, right? And so I'm a big believer in AI. I use it constantly, right? But I also want to understand its limitations and know what it can do and what it can't do currently. It's been expanding at exponential rates. It could, replace all of us in, 2 years, right? But
Right.
I think when you still need, like, the concept of accurate data is super important, right? So like if you're going to train your AI model on files that have poor data in them, like Excel files of your sales or something like that, and they don't match up to your other system, and then like you start using this tool to make decisions, it's not going to make the same decisions that you would expect it to. And you might, when you're testing it, say, why is it giving me this? Not even realizing, what you trained it on. So, I mean, there's always going to be the need for governance and accuracy on what you're putting into something, because, I mean, this is the biggest cliche of them all, but garbage in, garbage out, right? And so that whether an AI is doing it or a human's doing it, it's the same thing,
Yeah, yeah,
So
totally.
yeah, that's
What's your opinion on like synthetic data? Like there's the, to 100% agree, like garbage in, garbage out. If you're feeding AI or a human, either way, data that's not true or accurate or right or whatever, then you're going to get, on the other side of it, you're going to get something that's not very good or not very helpful. I've seen a lot of conversations online around like synthetic data. So basically, for those who listening and don't know what this is, it's this idea that you can use AI, you can give it data and say, hey, I want you to kind of take this and extrapolate over time and show me like what almost like projected results could be based on these variables. And then it creates a set of data for you, like that's like hypothetical, that you can then, use to inform decision making. There's a lot of polarized opinions about this idea, right? Because it's like, it's not real, blah, blah, blah. Like, is it, but I'm very interested to hear your opinion. Like, what's your perspective on synthetic data?
I think projections are good for giving you a goal and a roadmap. I don't necessarily think projections are something that you would want to decide whether something was correct or not correct. And so if you're extrapolating out, like based on a small set of data where things could be, like I can do that in a spreadsheet right now, like give me a half hour and, a set of data and I'll show you where it's going to go, or what I think it's going to go based on all these little factors that I think are going to impact it. But I'm not going to say, well, I ran my campaign, like I'm going to run this campaign in 6 months and it's going to do X. And after 6 months go by, I'm going to say, well, where's the source that actually tracked it to tell me whether it did what it did or didn't, right? Use the sample data set. Because again, projections are good for giving you a goal to meet, right? A lot of times you can project things and your projections are way off, right?
Yeah. I think of it as like finger in the wind, like you're kind of like, I think we're going that way. Like, I think based on these variables and these assumptions that we're probably going to need to go that direction, right? And you could use synthetic data to help you orient yourself. Like if, this is like over dramatizing it, but if like you're going east and then, you use synthetic data and other inputs to be able to say, actually, we need to be going north, like we're going the wrong, then I think it could be valuable. But to your point, like, you don't want to be like, it's not a be all end all for sure.
It makes a lot of sense what you're saying there, is because, like if you are looking at it in a way of being directional, it's often like projections are good for that, right? Projections are good for you to understand, like if I want to decide whether, let's say a feature on the website is going to be worth the development cost. What I might do in a projection is I might say, okay, I think this is going to increase my conversion rate by 0.3. And my current volume is X. What does that come out to? Oh, that's going to come out to a, $120,000 a year change. Okay, but my development cost with my, on this big enterprise platform I have might actually be $175,000 to get it done. Okay, well, my payback time's over a year. Is that worth it to me? Should I prioritize this over this other thing that might give me, 100,000 in increased revenue, but cost me, 10,000 to produce, right? Those are the benefits of projecting into the future, is to understand what you shouldn't do more often than what you should, right?
Yep.
Just based on, financial models, like, can I afford this type stuff?
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny. So I came up through the world of design, and I just recently wrote a post on LinkedIn about this, where in the design universe, most designers don't think this way. They don't take the time to sort of say, all right, if we go change this thing on the site or the app or whatever, like what's the real impact financially, right? Whether it's through a cost, like you're saving money or you're making money, one out of the two. And there's all these like derivatives or secondary metrics of like, oh, the satisfaction went up, or like more people clicked on this thing, or more people, whatever, responded. But it's like, yeah, but how much more money are they making? Or how much like how much less time are people spending doing the thing? And so it's very interesting because I think as you look forward, the kind of looking ahead on the time horizons, I think it's going to be like even more important, more than ever, that like everything people are doing, they're having to weigh those trade-offs, like to what you were describing, where you're saying, okay, is it worth 150 grand to go build this feature when it's only going to make us 75 grand? Probably not. Probably a stupid decision. Maybe we should take that same 150 and invest here, and it's actually going to yield 1.5 million, right? It's going to get 10x our return. And I think a lot of marketing folks understand that, like they, have pro formas and stuff to help calculate like what's the anticipated return if we spend money on this or versus that. But I think a lot of folks in the customer experience and design world they're not like MBAs. They're not usually good. This is an overgeneralization, but like most design folks that I've ever worked with are not typically great at math or great at, calculus or statistics. And so I think there's an opportunity, the sort of short version of everything I just said is I think there's an opportunity for a lot of folks to start to think in terms of, am I helping the company make money or I'm helping the company save money? And how am I doing that? And like very specifically like modeling that out. And you can use AI to help you sort of like determine like, okay, hey, these are the things I think will happen. These are the, this is the conversion rate. This is the click-through rate. This is the whatever. Go. And it's like, here, if you're assuming these things, you're probably going to save this much money per year, which then you're like, okay, great. Now, maybe I don't do this, right? To your point, like it's telling you what not to do. I'm not going to do this because it's not worth the investment. Or maybe it is, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I think so. I too started in design, which is interesting. Both of us came up that way. And over the years, I've had the opportunity to have one foot in the art and one foot in the science, right? And so I've led design teams and creatives, writers, photographers, videographers, all that stuff, right? And inevitably, what I've tried to do, which is, one of the points you were making was most of them are not, mathematicians, right? But they can understand pretty easily if an analyst or someone with that type of a skill set sits down with them and says, okay, these are the last 4 emails that you created. This one had many more clicks than the other one. Like once they start to get educated on, just what's better and what's worse, then inevitably they might start making decisions on their own and start asking like, how did that do? And then, you develop this data-driven decision making in non-traditional roles, right? But it does generally take an extra resource. Like on marketing teams, I generally will have an analyst that supports channel managers and creatives, and that analyst sits with them and goes over kind of how their work has improved or performed.
Yeah. That's awesome. I didn't realize you started as a designer. It's always cool to talk to folks who've kind of grown up through the design universe and then evolved into more of what we're talking about. I'd love to hear. So you've had a couple decades at this, and you've seen a lot of different organizations and a lot of industries. What are some of the examples of folks who are doing this well? Like who's getting the data architecture and the data-driven design pieces right?
I think a number of verticals are moving towards it or at better stages, right? So like if you think about like major household name CPG brands, right? They have the resources to do it well, but depending on the company and how much importance is put on, accurate data and, migrating to new systems that, have better controls, things like that. The larger they are, the harder it is to make the change, right? Infrastructure wise. So I would say there's some CPG companies, like big brand CPG companies that do it, amazingly well. Even service companies, like forgetting the name, but it's USA It's an insurance company, USA Insurance. It's began in serving military, right? And then it branched out to now anyone, if you have a relative who's in the military, you can get health insurance, life insurance, all these great things. And, I went to an analytics conference at Wharton a number of years ago, and there was a company presenting what at the time, was amazing. It was a system that was learned, like what we see now or what we think AI is now, this was being worked on maybe 10 years ago. Right. And they presented how they worked with USAA and how their system was able to predict with like a 90% accuracy what the next product that someone in their pipeline would want, and then had insane conversion rates, like similar numbers, 80, 90%. And how they described it was because the military has very good records and records of where people were, when they got married, what stage of life they're in. If you think about insurance, right? Like you're probably going to want life insurance after you have your first kid, right? Or, so they took all of this information that they had on, service members and were able to feed that in. It was very accurate, and we're able to build this recommendation engine, which, by the way, like that's what AI, a lot of these AIs are recommendation engines, from 10 years ago with algorithms that learn, and so, it was interesting to see that type of accuracy in data, like the results that it could push for. So, like I said, there's big companies that can be doing this extremely well. I'm assuming, Netflix is probably at the top of, the game. Your big tech companies are at the top of the game, right? Because they're all data. I mean, when you think about software, I don't know if a lot of people connect to the fact that software is just a way to visualize and enter data. You're really just filling up Excel sheets with information, no matter how pretty, the software is. Ultimately, I think those companies are doing things well. I think on a smaller side, I think digital first brands, like think up and coming health or beauty labels, right? They often start with platforms like Shopify Plus or BigCommerce, right? And so their data stays clean, and, because the system enforces consistency and integrates smoothly with other tools. There's whole ecosystems that were built around it. So, companies that embrace those newer technologies learn from kind of the antiquated past of having all this, chaos from, bad data, right? So they have I think a leg up. And then even, your traditional B2B businesses who I gave that one story earlier in the cast here about working with a company that was at the largest pet food distributor in the country, and they had antiquated systems, and ultimately we to the customers, right? And we decided how we were going to move forward with our platform based on what, the feedback they gave us. But a huge component of that was connecting an old A+ system to Salesforce and having to go in and go through. I personally went through 50,000 customer records and normalized the address fields, because we had address 1, 2, and 3, and some of them had the company name and address 1. Some of them actually had the address. Some of them had blanks. And so we had to, just to get Salesforce to connect to a system like that, we had to take 50,000 records and normalize into like 2 columns. And then, we had to also figure out ways. There were multiple accounts for the same businesses, and they could have multiple locations. So we had to create keys within the customer records to then, group customer accounts but if we didn't do all that foundational data work, we wouldn't have been able to launch the website on the platform that we launched it on and had the experience that gave them significantly increased experience, because what we saw within the first 6 months on a site that was that was doing well north of 10 figures, I had a 50% increase in the first 6 months. based on
Wow.
fixing the data and also listening to what the customers actually wanted.
Yeah. Those are good examples, man. So I've got three things to kind of add to what you're sharing, and then also a couple stories. So one, I think I was going to say the same thing, like the platforms, like the Netflix of the world, Amazon, et cetera, like they've kind of figured this out, right? Like to your point, 15, 20 years ago plus, they were, starting from zero, and they were able to build it more digital first. And then I think some of those are struggling a little bit more with like, they're not cloud native, right? So there's like the whole, how do we get our data in the cloud, and how do we make sure that it's like in a, in a, in a way that now even the more, the newer tools and technologies can really take advantage of it. But at the end of the day, like, I think they're probably like the foremost as far as like data is concerned. I have two others that are a little bit different. So one is sports. Sports is like crazy. Like I've worked with a couple different sports teams, and it's fascinating to see how much data they have. But I think what's really interesting about it is a lot of their data is about the athletes. They're not really about the fans. So they're collecting tons and tons of data to like optimize performance for their athletes, and then they're completely neglecting fan data. So then they like don't really know what their fans are doing when they're there. They don't know how they're interacting or engaging, which is an opportunity. But like when it comes to specifically, like sports science, sports medicine, how to optimize for performance, like they've nailed it, man. Like for example, the local basketball team, they have cameras all up in the rafters that are pointed down at the basketball court, and they can see within like microseconds, like if someone's like turning too hard on their ankle or whatever, they're like, hey, tell, so-and-so to stop turning so hard. And it's like real time, right? They've got like a BI team, the business intelligence team, that their whole job is to basically like monitor all these different things during the game and figure out like, hey, don't tell LaMelo to like go left anymore or whatever, right? Like they're sharing these kind of like insights, which just blew my mind. Like it blew my mind when I learned that this was the capability they had. And then again, it was like, I'm like, hey, what about the fans? Like how, like, oh, all the cameras are pointed at the ground, all the data is around the players. Like we don't know what the fans are doing. We don't know how they're buying. We don't know how they're moving around. I'm like, well, maybe do that. Maybe have some cameras pointing elsewhere, right?
Yeah.
And that actually leads to the next one, which is I think it's interesting to see how like fast food is or quick serve restaurants, QSR, are leveraging data now. A few years ago during COVID, we were working with a client that, this was my previous employer. We were working with a client that was trying to improve their drive-through experience. And one of the things like at that time that we learned was there's this organization at the time, they were brand new. They're much bigger now. It was called Vistry, and they do like computer vision with AI that they hook into your CCTV. So basically like the cameras around, a restaurant, they could connect it, and then it would automatically detect like where were people getting stuck, like in the store as well as outside the store, like where are the employees getting like hung up. It would even do like license plate tracking. So it would see like, okay, this car now is like tagged with a unique serial number, i.e. their license plate number. And then they could see like how many times does this person come back? How many times do they go here? What do they do? And it was so valuable because, our job was to help them improve the experience, and just having all this data from this platform that just kind of hooked into their existing CCTV system was like, it was like so enlightening. You're like, oh man, like, yeah, just do that. Like, don't do that anymore. Change this, And so anyway, I think there's a lot of like really interesting things that are happening in quick serve and retail, where people are tracking like all movement within a store. Like, how are people purchasing? Why are they, and you're able to see even like down to what are people's facial expressions when they're purchasing. So you're able to see like, are people typically smiling? Are they sad? Are they not? Like, and then you're able to modify or change how that experience plays out. And so people are much more likely to convert or to buy, because they've optimized all these little details that you as a consumer, like, you don't notice or care. Like, you don't know, like, the cashier is not smiling at you. So then you're kind of like, oh, this person's kind of grumpy. I don't think I'm going to buy the extra pack of gum on my way out the door. Right. Like, but now they're smiling. Oh yeah. And they're chatting with me. I want to grab a a Reese's bar or whatever. Like,
Yeah.
so anyway, those are a couple of other examples to add.
Yeah, it's interesting, that example just that you gave is it's very similar to these note takers, right? That we all have on our Zoom calls now. Right. You can see what percentage of the call people were smiling in,
Yeah.
it's becoming pervasive. And when you talk about quick serve food, I think they're somewhat at the forefront of a lot of stuff in that, I've been to a couple of drive-throughs in the past 6 to 8 months, and they've got AI, taking my order, right? And complicated orders that they didn't end up messing up, removing the pickles and, subbing out the beans for steak at Taco Bell, so it's interesting how tools like what you were using then probably could be connected to the AIs and that are actually interacting with the customers and drive a whole new level of
Exactly.
automated improvement.
Yeah. It'll be really, really interesting to watch. Like, so imagine a world in the not distant future where all this data is feeding into an LLM, and the LLM it's automatically optimizing. Right. It's like, okay, like we're noticing there's this trend where people are not smiling at the cash register. It automatically sends out a note to all, like it creates a training program, sends it out to all like frontline workers, the mandatory video that they have to watch it looks like a human, but it's like video generated by AI with a script generated by AI. And it's a 5-minute video that they're like, hey, be more friendly and happy when you're talking to customers because it's going to help us drive a 5% lift in conversion at the cart, or checkout. And like, I don't feel like these are like, obviously when I say these things, sometimes people are like, dude, what are you talking about? Like, this is science fiction. I'm like, no, really, we're not far. Like all of those capabilities that I just said, they exist right now. They're just not connected to one another. And as soon as we connect them, it's like, we won't have to do the optimization. That stuff's going to be just handled, right?
Well, what's really going to push it forward is right now we have generative AI, right? And generative AI needs instructions to kind of go off and do things, right? But agentative, I think I'm saying it right, AI is able to make decisions on its own on a very broad kind of scope, right? It's when that's probably going to drive the most change, right? Is agentative AI, right? It is very interesting to think about how basically having something that can make its own decisions towards a main goal of, let's say, selling as many chicken nuggets as possible through optimizing interactions with customers. The question is, then will everyone become more and more obese?
Yeah, the Wall-E, right? Wall-E World, the movie with the little robot where everyone's just kind of laying in chairs. Yeah, it'd be really interesting. I think it's AGI, artificial general intelligence, is like the one where they basically it functions like a human. I mean, essentially, it can like learn and make decisions, and it operates within kind of constraints that you give it. But it's capable of saying like, all right, like I'm observing these patterns, and I'm going because they're within my guardrails. I'm just going to take action and do it. It's like we're very close, and I think what humans, like what we will become more and more, critical for is the nuance, the relationships, the human stuff, the stuff that AI can't do, the soul stuff, right? Where it's like those moments, like we're using the cashier at the counter, right? Maybe there's no cashiers who are checking you out anymore because it's just handled, but you have people who are like spending time talking to the shoppers, getting to know them, like showing personal touch to every sort of stage of the journey where you're like, wow, I feel like they care. I feel like they actually are trying to help me. And then all the other sort of tedious, mundane stuff is just taken care of, right? And we're not necessarily having to like build all these little things. It's just building itself. It's like self-perpetuating, right? Like, oh, I see there's this other job that could be done. I'm just going to do it. Like, I don't have to like go ask for permission. I just make it happen, right?
Yeah. It's really wild where we're going.
Yeah.
It's amazing time to be alive.
Yeah. Very exciting. I think I've talked about this on the pod before, but like, we're at that, it's like the internet, the invention of the internet, right? Or that early days of the internet where everybody was like, whoa, you mean I could send an email to anybody anywhere? Like, holy cow, this is crazy, right? And like, that's kind of we're very quickly, like going from this rudimentary AI capability to like stuff, I have conversations every day, all day with people about these kinds of topics. And in every industry, like I was talking to somebody recently about probate attorney, right? It's like a estate planning and like how they're completely disrupting the industry with AI. And like, it's like one that you would never even think of, but it's an industry where historically it's a lot of like manual moving documents back and forth and spending a lot of time like extracting information out of it and figuring out okay, this is somebody's estate. This is what it's worth. How are we going to divvy it up? Like that's going to get upended by AI, right? Steel
Yeah.
manufacturing, same, right? Like stuff that you would never think of, but they're completely transforming.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think often we think AI, and even, bringing this back to data architecture, like even AI and the data itself, often, people think about, well, that's a marketer's thing, right? Conversion rates and this and that, right? Or maybe in a warehouse, okay, there's KPIs in the warehouse for performance and things like that. But the reality is every part of every organization could be measured and improved upon, right? And if you build a bot that can measure and improve upon things, well, I think you'll probably get some improvement, right?
Yeah, yeah, I love that. Like if you look at every facet of your organization and you think about what kind of data could be collected and how you might leverage that data to enhance and improve it, all of those things have an indirect or direct impact on the customer experience. And
Where the art really comes in is choosing the right KPIs. So like I've been in a number of organizations where it's very difficult to maintain a really tight, efficient inventory. And one of the things that you can be in a warehouse or an operation, and most companies are focused on fill rate, right? Because that's an operational metric that, really is part of that area. It doesn't really tie to anything financial, but it tells you, how quickly you're sending stuff, right? And there's a bunch of different ways to calculate fill rate. Like you could exclude stuff that's out of stock. You could, include it. But, we decided to use a metric of revenue lost due to out of stocks as being the key KPI in performance e-commerce business, right? And so when it came to that, right, like, yes, we want to know that things are going out on time, but how much money are we actually losing because these SKUs are all out of stock, right? You could have 50% of your inventory be out of stock, but they all be slow movers, long tail, right? And like your revenue loss due to out of stocks could be, 3% of what you would expect, right? But then you could have, 98% in stock, but your top SKUs are out of stock and, you've lost 50% of your potential revenue because of it, right? So that's one point I want to make about all this data stuff is it's super important to nail down what the right KPI is to get the right business result.
yeah, I love that example because you're dead on. A lot of people are measuring the wrong things, and they're like optimizing and optimizing and optimizing for a KPI that doesn't really mean much or doesn't really move the needle. And to your point about it, I love it. You called it the art part of this. Like, it's like, hey, take a step back. Like, is that the right thing you should be measuring? Right? Maybe there's something else that is really going to help you move that forward. I think so. This kind of brings us to our last question, which is we've talked about a lot. We've covered a lot of ground in this conversation. What are like 2 or 3 practical things that people listening could apply from what you're sharing?
So I have a good idea around this, and I'm just going to go through kind of a small laundry list, but it's really around data architecture, since that was our initial topic. I want to talk a little bit about. how to get that, right? And so I would say the first important thing is establishing a single source of truth, right? So picking one system that's the authoritative record for each type of data category, right? So like my sales numbers are coming out of my ERP, not my web platform, right? And that's what I'm always going to use. Next is normalize and cleanse your data, right? So implementing naming conventions, field validations, and cleaning rules, kind of like what I explained earlier. Like if your warehouse calls a product SKU-001 and your sales team calls it item 001, fix that, right? You should invest in data governance. You have clear policy who owns which data, how often it's updated, and what validation steps are required. Governance isn't bureaucracy, it's insurance for your data reliability, right? Say create ongoing feedback loops. We talked about this a little earlier. Data architecture is never finished. After a big launch, keep refining based on real world usage and new channels that emerge. I'd say tying data to customer experience improvements is another big one. Like remind your team at the end, that the end goal is a better customer journey. Measure, learn, adapt. If analytics show high cart abandonment at night, consider extended support hours or chatbots. And finally, I'd say bring employees along. Like champion the changes by explaining why accurate data benefits everyone. Provide training, quick wins, so they trust and adopt the new tools and processes. So similar to what we were talking about as a designer coming in and, bringing the photographer and the graphic designer along on the journey of performance.
Yeah, those are great. Those are really good. And I think very applicable. And most organizations could take, one of those things and make a massive impact. It's been fantastic to have you on the show, Mike. I'd love for you to share, where can folks find you online?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Drew. I'm active on LinkedIn. So, I share insights on data architecture and other e-commerce trends there. My profile page is Michael-Vandenstockt. It's easy. It's my name. There's not too many Vandenstocks in the United States. I'm easy to find. People can book an appointment with the link in my bio if they want to, have a call with me and discuss anything. Or they can just DM me, if they want to get in touch, and I'll respond back and we can go from there.
Awesome. And folks, you can find me online pretty much every social platform, Drew H. Burdick and drewburdick.com. Mike, really appreciate you being on the show, man. It was a great conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Drew. I really enjoyed it.